he embezzled over $22 million.
From influencers.
Yes, he had an accounting and finance degree, but he also graduated with an uncontrolled gambling addiction.
What was the most surprising things you've learned after defending accounting firms? Because you've seen what gets people in trouble.
When I think of what's surprising to me about accounting firms really isn't.
Natalia Greene is an attorney-turned-risk management expert helping accounting and professional firms reduce exposure and build resilience backed by over 20 years of litigation experience.
What was the feeling like that one of the cases you worked on was on TV?
It was, oh my God, I know this. If you ask any of these folks after the fact who have been through it, what are the ways to avoid being dragged into a lawsuit? Well, it starts with client acceptance and annual reevaluation of whether or not they should continue as an ongoing client.
What's the insurance policy nobody talks about, but every owner of a professional service actually needs?
I think.
Welcome back to the Diary of a CFO podcast, the podcast where finance leaders share the lessons, challenges, and wins that shape their careers as well as their organizations. I'm your host, Wassia Kamon, and today I'm super delighted to have with me Natalia Greene. Welcome to the show, Natalia.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, you started your career as a litigation lawyer, protecting accounting firms. Can you walk us through your journey and how you ended up specializing in our space?
Well, I can say this. As a child, I did not walk around saying, I think I'm going to be an attorney, or that I think I'm going to be representing accounting firms one day in litigation. Attorney on either side of my family that I looked up to or had to look up to. So I went into UCLA undeclared. I took some GE courses and I was sure I might be a Spanish station meteorologist. But then by my junior or senior year, due to things going on campus, I decided I wanted to pursue a law degree. And so I crossed town, went over to USC and got my JD. And then I did what we all do, is send out that resume to various civil litigation firms. And ultimately, I landed at Garrett and Tully. And that firm is a boutique Southern California law firm, but they do have a specialty practice representing attorneys and accountants. And so that is how I began working with professionals. And while I don't have a background in accounting, the accounting firm clients were my favorite to work with. And so for 21 years, I worked in litigation, fighting the good fight, defending our accounting firms against sometimes national firms. And I decided after that period of time that I wanted to kind of use my skills differently. And that's what brought me to Lemme. And in my role at Lemme, I get to do what I love most about being an attorney is I get to counsel accounting firms on risk management and help them with claims advocacy. And I don't have to spend every day, all day, fighting with opposing counsel over discovery or discovery motions. So it really has been a rewarding win for me to continue to work with accountants and accounting firms.
Wow, that's impressive. I love how you said you didn't know what you were doing. Me too. In college, you were like, sure. And that's kind of the way I also ended up in accounting. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, now I'm curious. You had some cases that have been featured on American Greed. That's one of my favorite TV show. For a decade, I've been like hooked on that show. So without giving any names, what's one case that really sticks with you and why?
Well, like you. So I was a fan of American Greed and I just watch it for my entertainment purposes. I find it fascinating. And so I just recall one day, this one stands out to me, and maybe it's because it was one of the first, perhaps, but I'm not quite sure. But I think it has to do literally with the facts of this particular matter. But I remember sitting there and all of a sudden you get the teaser and they said, there is an accountant in Laguna Niguel, California, who scammed her winery owner clients and other, small local businesses in some scheme that ultimately netted her $1.5 million of their money. And so I immediately sat up and I said, wait, hold up, wait a minute. I know that sounds very familiar to my case, the case that I had handled. And this particular individual, I think what stood out to me is the fact that this individual, she had, rented the beach house overlooking the ocean in Laguna Beach, California. She showed prospective clients this very, posh, office with the latest technology and software on the screens to impress them and credentials. But what I found really interesting is that her target or victims were, like a small winery, a Pilates studio, a hair salon, a local luxury travel agency, like small businesses in the community she was living in. And she literally would go and
Wow.
attend classes with them. She went to their wedding. She befriended them. They really thought that she
Wow.
was, their personal friend and happens to provide professional services. And they, gained trust in her, and allowed her to handle their, accounting records, and they trusted whatever she said. And somehow, because of those relationships, obviously, and because she was doing play dates with them and the whole thing, double dates and whatever, kids, spouses, the whole thing. And even actually, when one of the victims was in an in treatment drug rehab program, she was running their business and they thought, wow, she's just wonderful, trusted. And so she convinced all of them to make check payments to, quote, income tax payment. That's what these checks would be. And she told them, if you do this generic check, like that, that it'll enable me to pay any current or future taxes when they come up. And they, like I said, fully trusted her. And what made her really unique, because this is not like today's age, this is some years ago, but she went so far as to use, fake email accounts. She used software that changed her voice so that she would talk to her clients in a different voice, a different persona. She had software that showed a different caller ID number in case you did call with questions and concerns. And she even posed as a prospective buyer or investor for one of these victim clients. And so she went through all of those efforts, and you always kind of go, for what? It literally is for, American greed, right? It was the house that she lived in or rented, cosmetic surgery, an Arabian horse, vacations and
Wow.
and the sort.
That's in that again, I'm hooked on American Greed. So, but what was the feeling like? Like that one of the cases you worked on was on TV. Like, what was your initial reaction? I'm just curious.
Well,
Besides, oh my God, I know this.
well, it was, "Oh my god, I know this," and I do think it's fascinating, and while I'm surprised, whenever you have worked on something, you see it on a show that you watch, it's obviously takes on a whole different, interest level. But I think what I appreciated about this show, though, too, is the exposure that it shined a light on what could happen. Um,
Hmm.
and and really, because my client was actually an outside tax preparer for one of these victims, and that's how we came to know it. But they had no, they were told by the client to, like, deal with this lady only. So it was just, I'm just very glad that it was something that small businesses could, learn and understand, and also outside, you know, hardworking accountants and tax preparers to be on the lookout for, because, you may be someone who can, stop the bad behavior or the fraud that's happening.
Yes, and it ties beautifully with what you do now, which is like more on the prevention side. Like, what should people not do, or what should people be aware of, like on both sides? So, I'm pretty sure you've seen more embezzlement fraud cases. Would you mind sharing one more, just one last one, before we move on?
Well, I'll share one that I thought was kind of wild, more focused on the facts, that were available to the public. But I mean, this particular one, maybe it's, interesting to younger folks too, is this company represented influencers who were on YouTube and Instagram and the like.
Now I'm
Um,
scared. Now I'm
Yes,
scared.
and
Okay, go ahead.
so they, use this company to help kind of track, the payments that they were doing from subscribers and hits and all of that, and then they would send the money that came in and forward it on to these influencers. But a lot of the influencers, you can imagine, are kind of unsophisticated or don't necessarily know what they're doing, owing, and they're trusting, right? Well, this case involved an executive who worked for that company who was college educated. Guess what he had a background in? He had an accounting and finance degree, but he also graduated with an uncontrolled gambling addiction. And what was interesting about this, I mean, very smart, very obviously talented, and had great skills that could be useful to their company and to the client. However, his dreams were grander than that, and he, aspired and looked up to, and when you read a sentencing statement, he wanted to be among the best poker players in the tournament, that tournament circuit, and ultimately, what made this one kind of wild was literally during, the time that he was committing this fraudulent scheme, he actually became a world poker tournament champion with a seven-figure paycheck. And during that same period of time, he, claims to have won and lost $2 million on online slots in a 48-hour period. So right, so in the period of 3 to 4 years, which to me was not a long time, he embezzled over $22 million. Yes, because again, it was a bunch of them, a lot of them over time, and he also, claimed to be making payments. They were like ACH transactions because that's how they would get paid, these wire transfers to the influencers, and there was also supposedly, lease payments being made to a non-existent condo in Mexico that was supposedly used for business development purposes, but it was a fraudulent lease, that didn't exist. So he was, so that I think is probably a wild one watching it unfold or just wow. So he wasn't hiding. He was at the tournament, and I'm sure it cost a lot of money to enter those tournaments, and he was on the pages of the, poker, literature and
Wow.
publications as a winner.
Wow. That's wild. But what was the most surprising things you've learned after defending accounting firms, right? Because you've seen what gets people in trouble. Like, what are those things?
When I think of what's surprising to me about accounting firms really isn't so much related to this fraud or embezzlement or that sort of thing. Really, what kind of surprises me about accounting firms specifically as compared to other professionals and other is the fact that accounting firms and accountants are very receptive and adaptive to emerging technology and innovation. They as soon as that's, a new something comes out that they're willing to, use it, test it, figure out how they can implement it. And perhaps it's because they want to, perhaps it's because they have to understand it in order to serve their clients well and also for they themselves to become more efficient. So, that I think is what's really surprising to me is every time there's something new, the accounting firms are the first to kind of, "Oh, what is this about? How do we figure this out? What can we do with it? How is it used? Are our clients using it? How do we test it? How are we reporting it?" However, those sorts of things is kind of surprising to me, and maybe it's because attorneys are so reluctant to jump all in and when it comes to
Interesting.
technology and innovation.
Okay. So back to, accounting firm themselves when there is a case of embezzlement or any cases brought against them. When the fraud is discovered, people often point fingers at the auditors or anyone that touches the financial. Why is that?
Well, I think generally speaking, it's the public's view, right? That accountants, and in particular, or especially auditors, are professionals that have expertise and therefore they're in the best position to discover the fraud. They also start with an incorrect assumption, and that is the scope of the accountant's services. Whether it's bookkeeping, tax, audit, they believe or assume that that the accountant will be able to somehow uncover any fraud that exists, irrespective of how immaterial it is or how unrelated to the actual services that account is performing. Um, the third kind of component I think that goes into this is I think they also fail to appreciate the level of sophistication of those fraudsters, like we've kind of talked about and described. They're a lot of times they're very sophisticated people, they're very smart people, and also there usually is that complicating factor, which is you usually have a collusive third party who's helping to either perpetrate the fraud or conceal that fraud. So, but the reality that we have in each of these cases is who are the people that discover the fraud? And typically that is going to be a whistleblower. And that whistleblower oftentimes is someone that works alongside the person or people that are committing the fraud, right? They're sitting with that person day in and day out, and they're in the best position to see when their behavior changes or all of a sudden they seem to be able to afford all kinds of grand things that are inconsistent with their salary. They got the new cars, they're moving in the house, they're taking vacations, they're all of these different things. Um, and I think that you that so that's usually how it's, discovered is those things. Or the other way that it's discovered by these whistleblowers is or work coworkers is that fraudster, you know, is absent from a role or responsibility or can do it for whatever reason. And someone has to take over that task and they stumble upon it
Yes.
in, undertaking that
Mhm.
task.
Wow. And so from a legal perspective, like what does when is it that the blame actually hold up and when is it unfair? So let's say a fraud is discovered and of course we're going to blame the accountant, the auditor, the fractional CFO, whoever touched the financials. At what point does it actually hold up versus is it just unfair?
Well, so I think that let me kind of just back up in terms of the approach and how you figure out whether this is fair or unfair. And that starts with when
Uh-huh.
as an attorney defending an accounting firm or accountants, or as an accounting firm looking, at this issue, I think it's important to have an attorney involved early and upfront, because once you involve that attorney or the attorneys undertaking that investigation, it is under a privileged or protected, there's attorney client privilege, and you can be more, that you don't have to turn that over to the other side. But once you get that attorney in place, the really important thing is for that attorney to understand what claims are being asserted, what that engagement scope is based on a signed engagement agreement, um, to also identify what work papers and or email communication, that sort of thing, goes to that particular claim that's being asserted so that they can be collected and looked at, and also consideration of hiring a consulting expert. And the reason why you want to do that is you want an independent party that gives opines or gives an opinion on the standard of care. So you want under your cloak, again, your privilege, someone to say, hey, from an independent party looking at this as an expert, would you say that the accounting firm or the accountant met the standard of care? And if they did not, then you kind of don't start from a place of calling it unfair. You start saying, okay, what is the risk exposure? Because one, you want to say, okay, is there a problem with this particular audit? But you also want to know from that consulting expert if there are other issues that perhaps the claimants have not identified yet, but that may come up as this matter progresses. Because what you want to quickly pivot to is, okay, what positive facts or what positive aspects can we use to try and leverage to try and resolve this early? Because once you have to concede standard of care, then if there are damages that resulted from that, failure, then there's exposure. So addressing it early if you can and trying to resolve it is key. When it's unfair is when, the standard of care was met, and typically those scenarios where I've seen them, and of course I think all of them are unfair, but it's when the claimant or plaintiff, in my view, refuses to take responsibility for their own errors and or their cause of the damage. And unfortunately, in doing that or in defending it, the accounting firm and the accountant still has to foot the bill of a defense, even though there's no merit to the claim. That's when it seems very
Ouch.
unfair, but it's how it works
Wow.
here.
Now, back to the standard of duty of care and, thinking from a prevention standpoint, because there is now a lot of fractional CFOs, small firm, boutique firms, and, going after different niche within different industries. What would you say are some of the standard they need to understand to meet that duty of care? I know you mentioned something about the scope or the agreement. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I'll just say as a common and general proposition is that you have to be very, very clear and specific about the scope of the work that you intend to undertake. It should be documented. And so you don't want some generic, I'm going to provide accounting services or tax services. And it'd be this really broad thing because whenever a claim is made, it should typically the claimant is going to say that they relied upon you to do everything. Your scope was unlimited. And the only way to kind of push back on that is to have a signed engagement agreement that says, oh, no, no, no. Actually, the services that I signed up and agreed to perform for you, client, are, let's be clear, only this client, only this entity or entities that are identified in this agreement, only for maybe this particular year, financial statements or tax, whatever it is, tax year this or financial statement period that. And it also identifies in those signed engagement agreements that you need to have signed engagement agreements that also include in there the responsibilities of the client to provide you truthful, accurate, correct, you know, financial information. And again, depending on the engagement of the scope, whatever it is that the client's responsibilities or duties or obligations are. And that same agreement, having those kind of, agreements with a very clear scope often should include and do include, limitation of liability provisions. That's where you can try and control your exposure in the event that there is an error or dispute with the client. So that's really important. That's where you can limit the amount of damages they can come after you for. That may speak to where this may be litigated. If it's litigated, it may speak to the requirement to mediate the dispute before you file a lawsuit. So it gives the parties an opportunity to resolve before you turn to litigation. So I think those things are really important.
Wow. That's very eye-opening for me because I've worked on the other side, right? I received the engagement letter from the auditor, so I've never seen it really from their perspective or from the perspective of a business owner. Like you said, you can't just say providing accounting services and here's an invoice. You do need a contract, the engagement letter. But then I'm curious, once you have that nice engagement, what other things should people think about duty of care on how they staff the engagement? Like how did the whole thing goes on after the initial one?
It's very important, or I guess, one of the things that I think, you have to think about with your staffing, just I'll answer that and then I kind of go a little bit backwards with that. But I mean, with your staffing, you need to make sure that you have staff that have an appropriate level of skill and training for the engagement, whatever that is. They have an and or they have a lot of oversight if that's what's required because they lack some of that training and experience that may be needed and you're literally training them. And you also need to make sure or consider whether or not you're allocating enough time for the staff, the partner, the senior man, everybody on the engagement to perform those responsibilities on that engagement. That being said about the staffing, I think one thing, you know, like why or how is it that accountants miss like red flags? I think that's kind of
Mhm.
what you may be speaking to a bit. And I think the why often that happens is a lot of risk comes from professionals over reliance, in my view, sometimes on the checklist approach. It's like, I have this checklist for whatever the engagement is, whether it's tax or audit or whatever, and I'm going through the list and I'm checking it off. It's great to have those as resources. It's great to know that you didn't miss something, but that's not a replacement for the, the the thinking part, the does this make sense part, and what typically happens when a claim is asserted against an accounting firm or accountant or auditors and that sort of thing, the hindsight criticism is that the accountants lacked professional skepticism. They over relied on management or whoever management deemed the appropriate contact person, and they didn't for themselves, really actively engage in, does this make sense? Or I'm not satisfied with, especially if they get kind of pushback, right, from the other side. Just kind of, you're walking this line of, I don't want to upset the client, but I kind of need this. This is kind of good enough. But it's not when you're looking at your license on the line. You are a
Oh,
professional. They're hiring you to do your professional job, and you've gotta do it, and they have to cooperate with it. So I think that accountants have to really trust and utilize their instincts when they're kinda going through engagements and not overly rely on, like I said, kind of, "Oh, well, check the box, check the box, check the box. Is that in the file? It's in the file, it's in the file," and not really understanding why they need it, why it's important, and why do we have to document it. And I will stress that documentation is everything. If it is not documented, it didn't happen. So you later explaining, "Oh, I spoke to this person," or "We had a conversation," or "I did that analysis. I just didn't put it in here because I was satisfied." Well, then in the world of litigation, it didn't happen. So I think that's what I would caution.
wow. So to recap, so first, my engagement has to be on point. So the engagement contract, what are my responsibility? What is the scope of what I'll do needs to be on point. Then the people that will work on the engagement, the level of experience or oversight has to be on point. And then not just go by the checklist, but think outside the box, which is difficult when you also press for time, but good to remember. And then documentation. That's a lot of work. I don't think we factor all that when we bill people.
Right. Well, and that's a good point that you're making actually, is that, you may need to reevaluate your budget for the job, but, I think again, if you ask any of these folks after the fact who have been through it, um, what are the ways to avoid being dragged into a lawsuit? Well, it starts with client acceptance and this annual reevaluation of whether or not they should continue as an ongoing client, right? So you start with client acceptance and say, let me look at this client. Are we still at the outset, but each year, are we still a good fit? Does this client fit into my wheelhouse? Do I have the expertise? Do I have the team available? Do I have the time? How difficult or not difficult is this client? Does this client not give us documents on time? Does this document, I'm sorry, does this client not provide timely, accurate information? Do we need a long lead way? Are they kind of difficult to work with for our staff and therefore they take up a lot of time? And
Mm.
it's at that point you start thinking about, one, if they are still a good fit for you and your expertise or your level of comfort in the industry that they're in. They may switch to a different industry and maybe you're not so comfortable with that. You have to evaluate where your skill is and where what their need is to see if it's a great fit. And then also, as part of that, consider how much should I be charging given all of that information? Because not everybody is the
Yeah.
same, right? Some clients
Uh-huh.
require a lot more time for the same, scope of work than a different client.
Mhm.
And so maybe adjustments
Mhm.
need to be made. After you do that and you're satisfied that you have done your diligence in terms of evaluating this client, Googling them, searching them, making sure you understand who you're going to be working with and that you're comfortable. Absolutely the signed engagement agreement. I would suggest that usually it's if they're insistent on you using their engagement agreement, there's stuff in there that you should be looking carefully at with your counsel, your attorney, just to make sure that you understand what their terms are. And perhaps you want to, invest in coming up with your own engagement agreement if you don't have one to make sure that the language and the provisions and the limitations of liability that you feel are appropriate are included in that and work off of your engagement agreement and let them, maybe, go back and forth with you on your version of it. It's important that when you kind of hear some bubbling up, you know, there may be some complaints, there may be some issues with payment, there may be these things that are starting to make you think, I feel like there's something more here. At some point, I think it's really important for professionals, but accountants in particular, to consider whether or not they should reach out to their insurance broker and advise them that there may be a potential claim on the horizon or just talk through it. I can't stress how important that is because I think a lot of people think of it like auto insurance. Like, I don't want to report it because I don't want my insurance to go up and this, that, and the other. It's very, very different, I think, with professional liability because if you don't report it in time as you should have, you may be compromising your coverage down the line if it does turn into something because they're going to ask for all of the back and forth with the client or what happened or what led up to the ultimate claim. So that may be present a problem from an insurance perspective for you, but also you don't want to create a bad record. So if you contact your insurance broker, and they're we're a great one, but there's many others. But you contact them to help you navigate whether or not this is something to report, but also to consider whether or not you should have appointment of an attorney to help you navigate it, even though a lawsuit hasn't been filed yet, because a lot of times it's during that pre-litigation where you're trying to navigate it that you
Mhm.
may avoid the lawsuit altogether, but you also at least have some advice on how to not create a bad record. Because sometimes clients in trying to make it right with their client may, for example, be making admissions that can be used against them if this doesn't resolve and it turns to litigation. And again, if you admissions are sometimes impact your coverage if you made them, if you concede. So there's various things that you should consider when you kind of hear some bubbling up. But the first thing I would do is call your insurance broker, discuss it with them, whether or not, at least have the conversation about whether or not to report it to the insurance company.
See, you went 20,000 step ahead because sometimes when you think about a small accounting firm or a fractional CFO firm that's small, somebody saying, "Hey, I want to start a side gig. I'm going to be a fractional CFO. I'm going to do people books or taxes on the line." They're not even thinking about having insurance. So my question to you is, what's the insurance policy or the kind of insurance nobody talks about, but you know that every owner of a professional service, whether full-time or a side gig, actually needs?
I think it is very important to start off with um, really again. I'm not trying to sell this because this is where I'm at now. I'm really saying it is important that you consult with, at least have the conversation. If you don't have an insurance broker, you should talk to one. But the first thing you need is professional liability. I mean, E&O insurance is important. And in when you apply for that, however you apply for it, it's really important that you disclose in that application or with your broker who's helping you complete that application that you're forthright with the types of services you will be performing, the scope of services, because they're going to oftentimes say that application is part of your policy. So if said, "Oh, all I do is this type of services," and then you go and do some other type of professional services, that may not be considered coverage. So that's why it's really important that you speak with someone to understand in your E&O policy how you're defining professional services, what professional services are covered and not covered, and then also that once they have an understanding of the types of services you are performing or providing, it really has to be tailored, what other coverages you need. You might need director and officers insurance. You might need cyber
Wow.
insurance. You might need crime. But it really does take kind of understanding what you specifically are doing, what tasks you're performing, as to what coverages you may or may not need. And you want that they're coordinated so that in the event there is a claim, it's clear which policy is responding and who responds first. All of that coordination kind of comes when you have someone helping you, figure out what coverages do you actually need. So I can't really say the you need everything, what you need, but I can tell you I would definitely start with professional liability or insurance. And while I think it's really important that you talk to a broker who can discuss all the coverages to figure out what's best suited for what it is you're doing. When it comes to an E&O or professional service, uh,
What is an E&O?
it
What does
is
E&O stand for?
errors and omissions.
Errors and omissions.
Yes.
See? Okay.
So,
Keep going.
so errors and omissions is kind of commonly referred as professional liability insurance. It's the same. It's basically saying I'm in the event that I, commit an error claim that was from an actor error or omission of mine in performing that service, and I caused damage to somebody else, my client, and they sue me, that I have insurance that helps me to defend myself and or pay if if it's appropriate because I did in fact create an error. So that's what the professional liability or E&O insurance goes to. Your damage that you cause a third party from the performance of your services. So you start there. And in that insurance policy, that's where I was speaking to. It's important to, a few things to think about is how is professional services defined in that policy? Meaning
Mhm.
what services, you know? Is it just bookkeeping? Is it tax? Is it audit? Is it, software implementation? Is it, what are you doing as to what is covered under that policy? And importantly, in those policies is also understanding what is excluded from that coverage. So if you contract with someone and say, hey, I will assume liability or hold somebody harmless, and it's beyond what that policy covers, then that policy may not respond and you will be, you're personally liable for that. So there's things in there. And that's why I was speaking to, for example, if you admit, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I will make it right." Some policies say, "Yeah, you are not to admit liability." That may impact your coverage. So that's why I really go to you wanna talk to someone and, if someone says, "Hey, I want my fees back because you performed poorly and I don't think you should get your fees," well, that may not be covered under your policy. So it's just really important to understand what what is covered in that, what is excluded, and what may have very limited coverage. For example, some policies have very limited coverage for regulatory matters. So if the state board of accountancy or the SEC or the PCAOB or anything, if there's an investigation, it may be very limited as to how much of that policy will be covered and how much you'll be coming
Mhm.
out of pocket. But those
Mhm.
things are very important to, look at and know and understand.
Wow. This is super helpful. You probably have no idea, but Thank you so much for sharing all that. I just wanted to have a quick recap, right? So, for fractional CFOs and small firm owners, when we think about what are the simplest ways to avoid being dragged into lawsuit they had nothing to do with, to recap, you start with the engagement, making sure it's all clear, responsibility wise. You make sure again that the scope that's defining it is actually what you're going to do. And like we said, limited enough but not too broad to where you're doing whatever and we don't know who's responsible for what. And also the people you put on staff, how you document the whole process, but also how you insure yourself, which I think is like, oh my goodness, such an eye opener.
Yes.
It's a lot.
I definitely think that's important. I think
Thank you
the
so
only
much for
thing
sharing.
I would
Uh-huh.
maybe add to that is, you know, your scope and your engagement agreement should line up with what you're billing them for. Because if you say, I'm only engaged to do this service, but then your billing records show that you're doing all kinds of other and different services, then that's a problem. It's called scope creep. And again, if a lawsuit is filed down the road and they say you were my everything, and you say, no, 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 here's the engagement agreement. I only signed up for this. And they say, okay, well, deliver to me your engagement agreements and let's look at the emails. Or I'm sorry, your invoices. And you have to turn over your emails with them. So now all of a sudden, your invoices, your detailed billing records show I had a call with them about this. I had a call with them about that. I looked at this issue. I looked at that issue. Or your emails may suggest that you looked into something or you researched something that is inconsistent with the scope. So now you help them make their argument that you were their everything despite what the engagement agreement says. So your actions kind of have to mirror the agreement. And it's entirely possible that the engagement can evolve and change, and that's fine. But then what you do is you amend or somehow document it. It doesn't necessarily have to be another engagement agreement, but it is written, it's documented that you have asked me to undertake this additional, this is what I'm going to do, the limitations of it, etc. It's just, again, you want to document to be clear what it is you're doing and equally important, what you're not doing.
Hmm. That's so helpful because when we think about scope creep from a business standpoint, that, oh, I'm going to make more money, right? So, but from your perspective, you're like, but you have more exposure when you do that. And here are some of the things you should be thinking about in that process.
Yeah. And like I said, it's great that you're going to have a deeper, relationship or
Hmm.
an expanded service. Just document what that expanded service is and be, again, more specific. I'm going to take on, you've asked me to undertake this
Hmm.
project. I'm agreeing to do it. This is the time, the estimate,
No, that's
change in cost and how you're going to be billed
hmm.
and etc. It's just documenting what is and what is not.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I'm curious now. I started in accounting, so I feel like I see the word differently because of it. I see dollars, money, costs, margins everywhere. So you as a litigation lawyer for 20 years, how has your work shaped the way you approach decision in your personal life?
So it makes you paranoid. No. I'll start with well, I think as a litigation partner, I think as a certified fraud examiner, and I'll say as an insurance brokerage firm principal responsible for risk management and claims advocacy, all of those put together probably caused me to approach in my personal life questions along the lines of what risks does this opportunity present? Is there any way we can mitigate the risk so we have greater upside? And should I be documenting or have a contract, this event, this understanding, even in personal or my
Getting
child's,
your nails done, you need a contract.
Yes, no, yeah, well, I might stop short of there, but,
Okay.
you kind of think that way of what documentation should I retain or how should I confirm
Mm,
with someone an understanding or a responsibility and who's doing what. I
yeah.
joke about how I do this with my family and my children saying, "Okay, you are going to take care of this part and I'm going to take care of that part. Correct. Do we have an
Uh-huh.
understanding? Are we on the same
Wow.
page? Do I need to send you a text to confirm?
Handshake. That is so cool. I'm curious to know though, what's your favorite thing to do outside of work? That's risk-free, kinda.
Well, so we are definitely professional football fans. We like going to stadium games. If we're not at a stadium game, we like to host watch parties. Go Niners. We are Niners fans. So we're happy football season's back. So we're excited to go to some games. We'll see some Chargers as well. And, this is not day to day, but I always look forward to and start planning my next Caribbean island to visit. I've traveled several of them. I love them, and so I kind of keep working on expanding where I've been
Oh, good for you. Good for
till we
you. Well,
cover them
thank
all.
yeah, you're going to cover them all from an insurance standpoint as well also. You're probably the one
I
that check insure my flight. That's what you do?
I actually have tried to talk to my, litigation partners, my colleagues into
Uh-huh.
opening and also my insurance company and brokerage,
Mhm.
opening an office in one of these Caribbean islands that I will be happy to spend some time in because
Well,
I'm sure there is risk there that we should consider and advise on. There are accounting firms on each of those islands. I went to
mm.
Turks and Caicos, and I remember seeing, like, BDO, Ernst& and Young, all these
Oh
different
gosh,
there's a
yes,
lot of
yes.
accounting firms out
I'll
there in
be
the
your
Caribbean.
assistant, your accountant. We'll find a way to limit the scope, but I'll be there with you.
Sounds
Well,
good.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show, Natalia. This was super helpful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and it's been great. Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of the Diary of a CFO. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, review, subscribe, and share with others. Our website is thediaryofacfo.com. That's where you can find all the episodes, access all the guest profiles, see their bios, and their social media links. It is also the place where you can apply to be a guest on the podcast and have information about how you can sponsor the show. As always, if there is any topic you would like me to cover in the future, just email me at ask@thediaryofacfo.com. See you soon.
Wondering if you're ready for the CFO role? Find out with a free CFO readiness scorecard at cfo.scoreapp.com.